Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex and this week's episode is our Lord of the Rings State of the Format Address episode. So the set's been on Arena for about a week now, and you can consider this episode your one-stop shop for getting up to date on what's working in the format, what's not working in the format. Basically a deep dive to get you winning more as fast as we can. If you haven't joined us for one of these kind of episodes before, just to give you a bit of a rundown, we start big picture, touching on the broad strokes, the core ideas that'll, the most important ideas for finding success in the format, and then we kind of narrow in, talking about the archetypes, some key cards, that kind of stuff. So buckle in, it's going to be an episode that is very jam-packed of good info. I also want to note that there is an Arena Open event this weekend starting on July 1st. Wizards does not advertise these events particularly well, and I've had people in the past say they appreciate when I call it these events, so they're not surprised when they log in on the weekend and go, wait, there's an event this weekend? So day 2 day event, sealed on day 1 on the Saturday, draft on day 2 if you make it. And hopefully this episode is good preparation if you plan to play this weekend. And a quick note, just before we get into the good stuff, I do want to shout out the Patreon. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. All the support over there really does help the show keep on going. So really appreciate everybody who supports each week. Want to give a shout out. If you like the show, if you like what's happening here, maybe you feel like you've learned something, got a little bit better at Magic, maybe you want a few more drafts, go check it out. There's, of course, reward tiers over there, all focused on getting you better at limited Magic in some way or another. Link in the description if you want to check that out. All right, let's jump in. Before we get to the strictly strategy stuff, I want to try out a new little segment here I'm calling the Vibe Check, and I've done this in previous State of the Format episodes before, but it hasn't been formally addressed, and I figured, yeah, I do this enough that it deserves its own segment. Basically, this is just a little bit of a check-in on the set, the community reception to it, what people like about the set, what people don't like about the set. I think people, at the beginning of a format, like to be validated in some ways. If, they're like, oh, I hate the set, let me see if other people hate it as well. Or if, maybe they don't like the set right now, but other people really like it. I think it's good to hear what people like about it, so maybe you can start enjoying it a little bit more. And I guess that's kind of where I would start. This is a set, to cut to the chase, that is pretty color imbalanced. Black is the best color, and it's very, very, very good, and green is, by a lot of metrics, close to unplayable. And I want to stress, that doesn't mean green decks can never win. It just means that when you open your packs, you are going to feel, if you know the relative color balance, you're going to feel bad about taking a green rare over a good black common, because so much of the time, you're just going to get past bad green cards because there's not that many good green cards, and good black cards because there's a ton of good black cards. So if that's something that bugs you, yeah, this set might be a little bit off-putting. I personally don't mind that. I don't think color balance is all that important to a draft set. There is some amount of self-correction that can happen, I believe will happen. But I think no matter what draft set you talk about, there is going to be some color imbalance. Yes, some sets are more imbalanced than others. And again, if that is something that you very much dislike, there's no shame in that, of course. There's nothing wrong with that. On the flip side, I could say a lot of pretty good things about the set. Number one, I touched on this last week, but there's not an abundance of over-the-top bomb rares. I think most of the power in this set lies in the uncommons and the commons, and we're going to get into this, but some of the uncommons in this set are really, really busted. Mind you, the top of the tippity-top rares, there's like 3 or 4 rares that are some of the best rares we've seen in limited recent history. So there's this weird dynamic where the average rare is not very good, but the best of the best rares are still going to feel like game warping. So that again, it might not be something that is that appealing to you, but I do think a lot of people like when the commons are driving limited and the uncommons are driving limited, and we do have that here. And a quick detour, because I'm sure I've piqued some people's curiosity and I don't want to leave you hanging, just to mention those tippity-top busto rares. The 4 top rares in the set, in rough order, are Orcish Bowmasters, Anduril, Flame of the West, Horn of Gondor, and Witch King of Angmar. So we're just going to talk about these real quick. The number 1 best card in the set is Orcish Bowmaster. And by the way, this is using 17lands.com data. Just, these are the most winning rares in the set. Orcish Bowmaster is a card that I specifically do want to shout out. It's got a lot of constructed hype. I don't know if people know it's as good as it is in Limited. I think it's a card that when you read, you're like, okay, that seems pretty good, but maybe I'll take a removal spell over it. I've gotten past this card multiple times. I've gotten this card 4th pick on one occasion. Just to read this out, this is 1 in a black, 1/1 flash at rare. When it enters the battlefield, and whenever an opponent draws a card, except for the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmaster deals 1 damage to any target, then amass Orcs 1. So just to explain why this card is so busted, when you cast this on turn 2 and kill an opponent's 2/1, you're immediately a gigantic favorite to win the game, because you've played a 2-mana card that made 2 1/1s and then kill your opponent's 2-drop, and it's likely that that 1/1 Amass Orcs 1 token will then attack for 3 next turn or something, because you then play another Amass creature. So you're already off to like a busted start. You've 2 for 1 your opponent and gotten on board, but it just scales from there. Any amount of card draw they have just insanely punishes them. And the real kicker on this card is the ring. The second ability of the ring, the whenever you attack, draw a card, discard a card, that's not optional. So if your opponent has the second ability on the ring, they just cannot attack with that creature without giving you value. It's kind of absurd that this rare is in the set of like a rare that punishes the main set's mechanics so hard. So it's a combo of efficiency when you cast it, and flash is big too, of course, responding to a draw spell or killing something in combat, but also just the fact that even after its initial hit, it just sits there and becomes this gigantic threat, and even if your opponent kills it, you've probably already gotten value, and you're left with at least a 1/1 sitting around. So, just thought I'd do my due diligence there. I think the other 3 top rares here, Anduril, Flame of the West, Horn of Gondor, and Witch King of Angmar, these are a bit more self-explanatory. Anduril is the 3-mana, 2-to-equip equipment. The equipped creature gets +3/+1. When it attacks, it makes 2 spirit tokens. This card is like a better version of a sword in X and Y, because it makes the bodies, even if you like, with a Sword of Once in Future, or the red-green one from Phyrexia Albi one, you can usually let your opponent hit you once with that, and like, okay, I remove it and carry on with the game. Your opponent attacks once with this, and it's an attack trigger to make the spirits. The game's over, because every single turn they're just going to keep re-equipping the spirits and just hit you for a bunch, making tokens. Horn of Gondor is the artifact that when it ETBs, you make a 1/1 token, and you can pay 3 and tap it to create X 1/1 tokens, where X is the number of humans you control. You play this on turn 3, it's very, very difficult for your opponent to ever win that game. And Witch King of Angmar is the 5-mana, 5/3 mythic flyer that you can discard a card to make it indestructible, and whenever more or more of your opponent's creatures deals combat damage to you, each opponent sacrifices a creature that dealt combat damage, and the ring tempts you. So, again, these 3 are a little more obviously good. Did just want to point this out there, because aside from Orcish Bowmasters, I've also gotten past these other ones. Don't pass these cards. These are absurd, and for some stat context, these cards are winning at about 68 to 70% game in hand win rate, which is, I think, like top 10 of any rares we've ever seen on 17 lands history in the past, 5-6 years. So just something to note. Okay, so back to the Vibe Pip. So yes, color imbalance, if that's not your thing, you might decrease your enjoyment of this set. But I will note that I think an exceptional part about the set is the gameplay, at least by my standards. What I describe as good gameplay is you have a lot of decisions in the game, and your decisions matter. Now, mind you, when one of those cards I just talked about comes in, maybe your decisions feel like they're getting a bit invalidated, but games that don't include those, like, ridiculous mythics and rares, you really do have a lot of small decisions, and I do feel like those decisions matter. And a big part of those small decisions comes from the main mechanic, the ring. The ring tempts you, because you have to choose so many things. Like, am I going to attack here? What am I going to choose as my ring bearer? You have to plan many turns ahead. And I've kind of heard the thought that, oh, I feel like my actions don't matter. I feel like my opponent's just running me over. I'm playing my cards, my opponent's playing their cards, and my opponents don't matter. My actions don't feel like they matter too much. But then I look at their game logs, and I go, well, there's like 4 decisions here that you did X instead of Y, and I think the X would have been better than Y. And a lot of the time, it's sort of a little bit of a you don't know what you don't know situation, where I'll point out certain decision points, and the person will go, oh, I didn't even know that was a decision I could have made, right? I didn't know that was an option. So I think as an experienced player, that is good gameplay. But I'll also recognize that might be off-putting to a lot of people, because some people just want to draft their deck, feel like, hey, I drafted a pretty good deck, and it's not that difficult to play. I don't feel like I'm on pins and needles in danger of making a mistake, like, one wrong move, and I can just, spiral out of control in this game. That might be a downside to some people, and I do really want to respect that. So just to close this section, I really like this set. Again, I think the gameplay is phenomenal. I think the draft is fine. It's not one of the more exciting or dynamic draft formats, but it's still just, functional. I feel like I don't have any problems with it. And I also think, like we're going to get into in a second, even though there is color imbalance, I think there are ways to draft the lesser colors to some success. All right, now we're going to move into the key big picture points for attaining success in this format. So if you listened to last week's episode, the set overview episode, which was the episode I put out after I played early access, after I went to pre-release, just talking about my experience with the set, I feel like my takes were like 80% accurate. I feel like I was watching the episode back before I recorded this episode. I went, yeah, that's about right. That's about right. But I was wrong on one fairly big aspect of the set, and that is Tempted by the Ring. I said it was kind of this glue mechanic, sort of the backdrop for a lot of archetypes. You know, it's nice to up the number of legendary creatures in your deck for cards that care about that. It enables, you know, like the draw 2 synergies. It enables, like, you know, a few, basically it holds things together. But my view has completely changed after playing more and more this week. This is the number one mechanic you need to understand to do well in the format. And when I say to understand, I really just mean this is the number one mechanic you need in your deck to do well, because it's extremely powerful. The person who has the most Tempted by the Ring triggers often wins a game of Magic. And the thing is, it's not just one archetype. All of the colors have access to it to some degree, so you can employ what I'm about to talk about here to every single one of your decks. Now, some decks and some colors do have better Tempt cards than others, and part of the reason why black is so good is a lot of the Tempt cards in black are excellent, but a lot of the broad strategy points can apply to any deck. So just to go over the broad strokes of this mechanic for those who haven't realized the power of how good this mechanic is, how powerful it is, that first ability, your Ring Bearer is legendary and can't be blocked with creatures greater power. So, like I mentioned, there are things that care about you having legendary creatures or just upping your legend count. That is good. But that skulk, quote-unquote skulk ability, making your, like, 1/3s be able to sneak in damage, that matters quite a bit of the time, right? That chips in for damage. It is almost like having a cheap flyer on the battlefield. And in fact, there's actually a distinct lack of flyers in this set, I think, because they wanted to make sure just not everything was evasive. There's not too many flyers because they knew that the ring was going to cause some evasion in the first place. So just having a battlefield where, it's a bit stalled out and having maybe even a 2-powered creature that can get in, that's meaningful. The second ability, though, and why it's so important to just get as many Tempt cards into your deck, is getting to that second ability of whenever the Ring Bearer attacks, draw a card, then discard a card. When your opponent gets Tempted by the Ring for the first time and they get that first evasion ability, you're like, okay, that's fine. It's not too big of a deal. But as soon as you hit that second ability, you immediately feel, I need to kill that thing. I need to kill that Ring Bearer because they're just going to filter their draws in a way that if I'm not doing the same, there's virtually no way that I can come back in a reasonable manner if this game goes, 3, 4, 5 more turns. It's almost like in constructed formats. In older constructed formats, people play with cards like Ponder and Preordain, all these cheap cantrips, Brainstorm, that just give them consistency. And especially in Limited, where we do lack that a lot of the time. We don't have access to just like all the cheap, efficient card draw in the world, or a lot of filtering mechanics. And in fact, aside from the ring, there really aren't many mana smoothing mechanics. You draw a few too many lands, well, sorry, like a lot of times that's a death knell. But just having access to that real power of consistency. I just really want to hammer that home. How powerful consistency can be. I talk about how important a good mana base can be. So you're consistent, you're always casting your spells. That second ability is very much the same thing. And, I would say, there's a lot of games I'm sure you've played of limited Magic over the years where both players are kind of staring at each other and you're in top deck mode and you're like, okay, they drew a land, I drew a land, they drew a spell, I drew a spell. You're kind of keeping pace. If you get to that game state, and that game state happens relatively frequently in this set, it's not giant board stalls, but it is to the point where it's like, okay, no player is a great attack. You do end up in a spot where it's like, wow, they're just looting every single turn, and I just cannot come back from that. And then, of course, they go out of their way, they use some resources to kill that, stupid little 1/3 that you played early, because that's the biggest start on the board, and that means they have less removal to deal with your, higher rarity cards, your great uncommons that you might have. It means that they are taking time off not developing their own board. And, of course, this might be all for naught, because you draw yet another creature or spell that tempts you, and you're like, all right, now my new thing is the Ring Bearer now. It's a really, really impactful part of this format and really something to pay attention to. And of course, decks that are filled with tempting cards, you can get to that fourth ability pretty quickly. I've had some really nice curve outs where I went like Birthday Escape, which is the 1 blue mana sorcery that draws the cards and tempts you. Like Birthday Escape, and then on turn 2, double Birthday Escape, and then I played a Bilbo, the 1 red-blue 1/3 that when it hits you, when it enters it tempts you, and then when it hits you, you make a treasure. It was a fully powered ring on turn 4, and I very easily won that game, right? And you can have decks, you're not always going to have nasty curve outs like that, but you can definitely have curve outs where you tempt early, you tempt on 3, you tempt on 4, and then every single common, but mind you, we're talking about commons here. Of course, there's some awesome rares and uncommons that tempt you, but a lot of the commons, the best commons in the set, are just the ones that tempt you. And you're like, hey, cool, I drew my random Rohirrim Lancer, my 4-mana 4/3 that tempt, and now I made a premium threat, and you now have to deal with this because it's not only looting and filtering, but hitting you for like 4, because I have the last ability, the Ring Bearer, that when the creature deals damage, each opponent loses 3 life. So if you haven't grasped or felt just how good this mechanic is, that's one thing you can change. If you're losing, just keep drafting more cards that tempt you. All right, I think I've sung the praises of this mechanic enough. Let's get into some actionable stuff. So what does this mean for your drafting and deck building? Well, of course, it means I'm just trying to get as many cards that say the ring tempts you into my deck as possible. The top common in the set, Claim the Precious, the 1 black sorcery, destroy target creature, the ring tempts you. This is a card that I actually underrated before playing the set because I thought, okay, it's a murder variant, and murder's pretty good, but sorcery speed is much worse than instant speed, and, the ring tempts you, so it's a nice upside, but probably isn't that much of an upside. I would say if you want to put it in, like, fractional card terms, which is always kind of abstract and messy, you can think of any time it says the ring tempts you, that's like 1.2 of a card or something, which, may or not be very helpful. So just, like, the more cards that say the ring tempts you, you're, like, fractionally up a card a lot of the time. So Claim the Precious is just great. But past that, the creatures that enter the battlefield and tempt you, those cards are also fantastic. So Urkai Berserker, this is the 2 in a black, 3/2, that when it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. Relentless Rohirrim, this is a 3 in the red, 4/3, that when it ETBs, the ring tempts you. If you haven't been accustomed or really haven't grokked how good the ring is yet, you might not have been drafting these cards that highly, but these are some of the best commons in their colors. These cards are currently going fairly late, like around the I'd say like 6, 7, 8 mark, and sometimes the Relentless Rohirrim even wheels. These cards are quite good, and I expect in a week or two, they're not going to wheel. I think you're probably going to have to take these in like the 4th to 6th range. They are that good. So do not underrate these cards. Anything that into the battlefield and tempts you, you're going to want these in your deck. You're going to want to draft them highly. And just for a benchmark, I think you're going to want something in the neighborhood of like 6, 7, 8 tempt cards in your deck in most decks. I was talking about how that second ability of the ring, when you attack, you get to draw a card, discard a card. That's the real key one. And 6, 7, 8 means you're gonna, in most games, be able to tempt twice. And of course, in some, you'll be able to tempt more. And honestly, sometimes just getting to that second ability and attacking once, just one good attack, maybe they then untap and kill your creature, and you never draw a tempt card ever again. That's good enough. Cashing in that one situational spell for a good spell, or cashing in a spell for a land that you needed, or cashing in a land that you don't need for a spell. That is the small edge that you need in a lot of these games to actually just carry it home. Like that's going to be the difference maker in so many of the games, getting to that second ability. So aim for that 5, 6, 7 range for getting to that second ability in most games. And just to call out some of the other good cards that tempt you, Birthday Escape. This is the single blue mana sorcery draw card, the rings tempts you. This is my take for the best blue common. I think just having multiple of these is really good in your deck. Mind you, just a little note, once you start to get 3 or 4 of them, you probably want to cut a land because you do start to accrue some land. So I'd say for every like 3 of them, you can comfortably cut probably not an island, because island is going to be the one you want to be able to cast these to get to your next spells. But let's say you're playing a blue-red deck and you have 3 Birthday Escapes, you can probably play 16 lands and cut one of your mountains. But this is just a low opportunity cost way to get that ring going. I was talking about that dream curve out situation I had with turn 3 Bilbo having the fully powered ring on turn 3. It's not going to happen all the time, but again, just getting you to that second ability really does matter. Also, with Birthday Escape here, don't be afraid to fire it off on turn 1. Like, I know there's some hesitation for it's like, okay, well, I want to cast it and, give my opponent, or give the ring to something. But again, that first ability, it matters sometimes, but it's not that important. I really think you should just cast this on turn 1 most of the time. Dig through your deck, get to further cards. And this is quite a good card. Like, a deck with 3, 4 Birthday Escapes, I just feel great about that. And even the green cards, I mentioned that green is not the best color in the set. In fact, it's the worst by quite a bit. Some of the better green commons are the ones that tempt you. So a card like Enraged Horn, this is the 5 mana, 4 and a green, 4/5 trample. When it ETBs, the ring tempts you. Mirror Guardian, this is the 2 and a green, 4/2, then when it dies, the ring tempts you. These are solid green cards. So if you do somehow find yourself in a green deck, these are the ones you're going to want to prioritize a lot of the time. And the ring tempting you is a mechanic that, kind of obviously, I would say, plays well with itself. The more tempt you have, the more tempt you want, right? I was talking about that threshold of 6, 7, 8. And once you're there, or if you're just below that and trying to get to there, like once you're at that 8, you're like, okay, I just want more and more Tempt stuff. And maybe later in the draft, you're like, okay, well, I need more Tempt stuff. You can start to prioritize cards that maybe aren't the best on face value, but do say the ring tempts you. Some examples here. Breaking of the Fellowship. This is the 1 in a red sorcery speed removal spell. Target creature an opponent controls deals damage equal to its power to another target creature that player controls. If you had no other Tempt in your deck, this card is like, a D. It's not very good. It never really kills what you want it to. Sometimes it does when they have 2 equally big creatures, but most of the time you're going to be killing their second best thing. But if you are late in pack 3, and you're like, hey, I need a few more cards to get to that 5 threshold of 5 tempting things, or you've already got a lot of tempt things, and again, Tempt plays well with more tempt, you can put Breaking of the Fellowship in your deck because you're just going to more often be able to turbo charge that ring. This is a card you can pretty happily play in your deck. It goes from like a D to a C. Another example here, Stalwarts of Osgiliath. This is the 5 mana, 4 and a white, 4/3 that when it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. And it also has whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Stalwarts. Like, this is the same kind of card where it's like, all right, it's not a great card, but if you need to get to that minimum threshold or you already have a lot of tempting, this is a card I'm pretty happy to put in my deck. I do want to call out some exceptions because I would say 95 of the temp cards are just pretty good. You can be pretty safe putting them in your deck. There are 2 cards here I want to call out at common that I think you can mostly shy away from. Slip on the Ring and Bombadil's Song. So Slip on the Ring is the 1 in a black instant. Exile target creature you own and then return to the battlefield under your control. The ring tempts you. I think this is a passable card if you need more tempting, have a ton of tempt, and have a lot of enter the battlefield effects. Like, you don't want to just think of this as a protection spell because you do want to use the ring proactively. Like, that's kind of the play pattern of the ring. You want to be able to cast it before combat a lot of the times, cast something that tempts you, then get that loot and be able to keep going. This just gets stuck in your hand too often. I think you can break that a little bit if you've got 5, 6, 7 things with good enter the battlefield effects, but that's not that common. Although, if you do have a lot of things that enter the battlefield and tempt you, that's not too bad either. Bombadil's Song is kind of similar. This is the 1 in a green instant. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 against hexproof until end of turn, and then the ring tempts you. It's just a bit too reactive. We've seen these kind of green protection spells in the past, and they've been pretty good. The difference with this one is it's not good in combat. Like, +1/+1 for 2 mana is just not good enough, even with the ring tempting you. So don't look at this as like a Tamiyo safekeeping or a Gaia's Gift. It's much worse than that. So these are some of the ones I would shy away from, but generally, you can just trust the things that say the ring tempts you to be solid cards in your deck. And just some final thoughts about the ring before we move on to the other stuff we got to talk about today. I just want to talk about some play patterns, some gameplay stuff going on with the ring, because like I mentioned, a lot of the complexity of the gameplay does come down to the decisions you're making with the ring. When should I attack? What should I give the ring to? And there's a few factors you want to consider when you're deciding just that initial, hey, what am I giving the ring to? One thing I will say is the more tempting you have, the less it matters because the more you can just keep resetting. But all things being equal, you generally want to give the ring to a low power, high toughness creature. And this has been noted on my podcast and other podcasts before, but something like Peligro Survivor, right, the 2 mana, 1/3 in blue, like, you give the ring to that, it's going to get in pretty consistently, going to be able to keep looting because your opponent's 2 power creatures, of course, can't block it, and it doesn't just trade with a 1/1. A 1/3 is a good ring bearer body, but you're not always going to give it to your smallest thing. Sometimes your opponent has a 1/3 of their own, and you're just going to give it to, you cast a Relentless Rohirrim, the 4 mana 4/3 that enters and tempts you. You're just going to give it to that because you attack with your 1/3, they block with your 1/3. So a good heuristic to have, and this is kind of obvious maybe, but just to spell it out, is if they don't have a 1 power creature or just, something that can block your ring bearer, put it on your smallest thing. But if they have some 1/1s lying around or a 1/3 lying around, put it on a reasonably large thing because that reasonably large thing has a better chance of getting in. Your opponent might have to double block it. So the default is to give to a small thing, but I've seen a lot of people make that mistake and then go, uh-oh, wait, they can just block, right? It's very, I think our instinct just tells you, oh yes, the ring goes in the small things, but that's not always true if the battlefield on the opposite side also has a lot of 1/3s. And another thing to consider, it's kind of funny, before the set came out, when people saw the ring emblem, they're like, oh, it's such a flavor fail because there's no downside to the ring. But there is a minor downside, I would argue, in that your opponent is going to want to point a removal spell at whatever you give the ring to, or they're going to want to block it pretty readily, right? They're going to want to go out of their way to deal with it. So it makes that thing a target. Your priority should be to give the ring to the thing that will get in multiple times. But if all things are equal, give it to your creature that is doesn't have a good static ability. Just, you don't care that much about it. Your worst creature, because that is going to be the one that they want to kill. You want to diversify your threats a little bit. I think the gameplay complexities of the ring are a bit out of the scope of what this podcast today is going to be able to cover. In a week or two, I'm going to be doing the gameplay level up episode for this format. I'm sure I'm going to get a little more in depth than that. So, that's, the cursory stuff that I cover, I think, is the most important stuff. But like I said, there are some complexities that you might encounter. The final thought I have about this mechanic in this section is you can think of tempting as an archetype in its own. Like, it transcends colors, really. Like I mentioned, every single color has access to this mechanic in varying degrees, and some of the colors have access to the better cards. But, you take a red-black deck, and you say, hey, what's your red-black deck doing? Oh, red-black is amassed in this format, right? And I've definitely had decks that I would not describe as red-black amassing. I have 9 Tempt cards. Sure, I have an amass card here or there, but so much of my deck building and drafting decisions and gameplay decisions hinge around the fact that I know I'm going to be able to get that second, third, fourth ability of the ring, and that's the theme of my deck. So think of it as its own deck, its own archetype, and arguably it is the best archetype in the set, even though you can't attribute it to a certain color pair. Although red-black tempting is probably the best deck. All right, let's move on to something else now, and that's the cycle of 5 common land cyclers, which have been actually a bit of a hot topic. I've had a lot of people ask me, do you like these? Where are you on these cards? How many copies do you want to play? Generally speaking, I would say yes, I like these. I think the way to think about these cards, by the way, this is Troll of Khazad-dûm, the 6-mana, 6/5 mega menace creature in black. Lorien Reveal, the draw 3. Oliphant, the 6/4 that has trample. When it attacks, you get something else. +2/+0 and trample. Generous Ent, the 6-mana, 5/7 in green with reach that makes a food token. And Eagles of the North, the 3/3 flyer that pumps your team. You should think of these as value lands, value tapped lands. And I think you can cut lands for them on a 1-to-1 ratio. The first one for sure. Like, I think your first Troll, you can just cut a swamp for it if you have enough playables, right? Like, sometimes you play 17 lands in this because your 17 or your 23rd other spell is not that good. But if you just have 23 other good spells, just consider this a tapped value land. I think you can even cut the second basic land for your second cycler, but the way you want to think about that and making that decision is mostly how aggressive your deck is. I'm more likely to cut lands kind of counterintuitively in my non-aggressive decks, my slower decks, my more mid-range decks, rather than my aggressive decks, because if you just think about the analogy I just made, think of these as tapped value lands, right? A Zendikar MDFC is probably the best one-to-one analogy. You just don't want that many tapped lands in your aggro deck, right? Your aggro deck really, really values the untapped mana. A lot of times you can get away with kind of just cycling this on turn 1, and you have a tapped land on turn 1 in your aggro decks, but some aggro decks have a lot of 1-drops too. So the more I want to spend mana on turn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 without having any stumbles, just curving out, the less likely I am going to be playing multiple of these cards. I think still in your aggro decks, like your Oliphant, you're going to play a copy of that. I think that's just fine. But I have in my slower decks cut 3 lands. That's the max I've done, and I've seen Sam Black go. He's been experimenting going even lower with like 12 lands. But that's kind of the way you want to think about it. The more aggressive your deck is, the less it wants a land cycler, and vice versa. And just to touch on the power level of these cards quickly, the Sultai ones, the Generous Ent, Lorien Revealed, and the Troll, these are the best ones. I think Oliphant is okay, and I haven't actually liked Eagle of the North that much. I think the effect is just not as good, is not as impactful as the other ones. Like, the blue deck's really like a draw 3, the green deck's really like a stabilizing 6-drop. You don't mind a good top end threat in your red and black decks. So that's just like my rough power level ranking. So hopefully that gives a little bit of clarity for how you're going to be building your decks. And I guess one other thing I would mention too is I think these are fine early picks. Like, if you think about, in cube draft, you often take lands relatively highly because they add to your deck without taking a spell slot. It's kind of the same thing with these land cyclers. So what I would also say is that if you're a little bit later in the draft and you're not sure you're going to make 23 good playables, or you've started out the draft kind of wishy-washy, I would I'd lean away from taking these, lean towards taking just good spells, because you're unsure if you're going to get to those 23 playables and be able to upgrade your basic land into a land cycler, right? You only have the privilege of upgrading a basic land to a land cycler if you have 23 good playables already. All right, and next up, just to give you a bit of a lay of the land of the more of the set, I'm just going to go through each of the colors, talking about the commons, talking about the top commons in each color, and what each of the colors is doing in the format, kind of how you want to be positioning yourself strategically, what each color is doing. Starting, of course, with black, which is the best color. And it's the best color for a few reasons. One, and this is often the case, like just pound for pound, the power you're getting, whatever you're getting for your mana on a lot of these commons is just better than what a lot of the other colors might offer, or at very least, the better colors offer a lot more of that than the weaker colors do. But it also has access to the best Tempt cards, I believe, at common, and access to a lot of the good amass cards at common. And those are kind of the strongest mechanics in the set. Starting out here, we've got the two kind of neck and neck top commons, Dunlane Crabane and Claim the Precious. Claim the Precious, of course, being the removal spell that tempts you. Dunlane Crabane being the 3-mana 1/1 flyer that amasses 2. I also want to note with these cards in particular, they are so close that I think it's worth diving into 17 land stats a little bit on these. Claim the Precious has a better game in hand win rate, which just means if this card was either in my opening hand or I have drawn it, it's a good card. It has a slightly better game in hand win rate than Dunlane Crabane. Basically, if I saw this at any point in the game, right? Dunlane Crabane, though, has a higher opening hand win rate than Claim the Precious, which makes sense because removal spells in your opening hand are fine, but you often want your early turns to be just playing out your creatures first, and Crabane is one of the best creatures to play. I'm gonna get into a little more depth on why in this set it might be better to value opening hand win rate if you're somebody who really pays attention to the stats and wants the down low on that. I'm just highlighting it here because I think it's worth noting that Claim the Precious and Dunlane Crabane, neither is strictly better than the other. They just happen to excel at different points in each game. So those are the top two black commons and my take for the top two commons in the set overall. Black is quite deep, another reason why it's so good. So we're going to go through a few tiers of cards here. So that's the very tippity top tier with Crabane and Claim the Precious. Now you've got this just under that tier with Easterling Vanguard and Torment of Golem. So Easterling Vanguard is 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 2/1 that when it dies, you amass Orcs 1. This card, I've been calling it unblockable and also moat, which basically just means your opponent does not want to block this in the early game and give you a 1/1, and also your opponent doesn't want to attack into it because it's like, well, I attack my 2/2 in, the person with the Vanguard is up on that exchange because they can just block and make a 1/1. So it's just a really, really annoying 2-drop. It's just a quality card. And then we have Torment of Golem, which is 3 and a black for a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card, amass Orcs 2. This card's awesome. I really just want to put this card on the radar of everybody. I know some people are definitely privy to this card being good, but this is like a top 5 common in the set. It is excellent. The ability to see your opponent's hand, take the best thing, get a 2/2 body, or at very least 2/2 worth of stats on something else, plan around their game plan. We've kind of just seen time and time again in the last little while that the playable hand disruption, the stuff that's not just duress or, the 1 mana hand disruption that's more aimed at constructed, stuff that leaves behind a body or stuff that, gives you a buyout like Traumatic Revelation from March of the Machine, just tends to be pretty darn good. And this one in particular is good in this set because it does play well with one of the better mechanics in the set with amass. I would play multiple copies of this card. I think you can draft it pretty highly. You're going to end up in some pods where they don't respect it. They don't know it's good just yet. Maybe you get them on the wheel. That's something to note so that when you go into pack 2 and you see one early, well, you're like, okay, well, wheeled in pack 1. I probably don't have to take it that early in pack 2. I'll take this other card. But it's good. Like, I would play 3 copies of this card fairly happily. It's also particularly good in blue-black, where you have Peligre Survivor, which is the 2 mana 1/3 that adds a mana of any color for spells. Casting this in turn 3 is pretty darn good. So I probably don't have to convince the people who already know this card is good, but I really just wanted to illuminate this card because I know this is one of the most underrated cards in the set right now. It's performing as a top 5 common and being drafted as a bottom 70% common. So just worth noting. And then the hits keep on coming. We've got Mordor Muster, which is 2 mana, draw a card, you lose a life, amass Orcs 1, just a solid 2. Uruk-hai Berserker, like I mentioned before, 3 mana, 3/2, that tempts you. This is, the tier right below the other cards we just talked about. And then we get to the next tier down, which is still solid cards. Troll of Khazad-dûm, which is the black land cycler. Haunted the Dead Marshes is an interesting one too. So this is the 1 mana 1/1 that when it ETBs you scry 1. And then if you control a legendary, you can pay 2 and a black and return the hunt from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is a nice little card. It plays well with the sacrifice themes. It just, get on board early. You can trade with 2/1s. Often it's a real pain in the mid game because it's not that hard to have a legendary creature as long as you're prioritizing the tempting cards, as you should be. So it's just this thing that every other turn comes back and blocks or trades, and scries you gets a little bit of card selection. Also not a bad thing to just pitch to the graveyard when you've got that second ability of the ring. And then Shalob's Ambush, single black mana for an instant. Target creature gets +1/+2 and gains Death Touch. You create a food token. Just a good card. Like, doesn't excel anywhere in particular. I guess I would say you really want to make sure you have some cheap creatures, but even if you don't, like, a lot of times it's not that bad. Like, tricks play better if you've got a lot of 2-drops, but if you're a slower black deck with, you know, maybe not that many 2-drops, your 2-drop stuff is interaction instead, it's still, they're still going to find a place for it to be good. So I'm very happy with, like, I would almost never cut the first copy of Ambush in any of my black decks. And then the last black card I want to talk about here, last black comment, is Sam's Desperate Rescue. So this is a single black mana for a sorcery. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. The ring tempts you. So it's an interesting card, and this is where I really want to use this card as an example for why opening hand win rate in this set, again, if you are somebody who likes to look at the 17 lands data, may be more important for evaluating what cards perform well than game and hand win rate. So this is a card that you don't really want more than one copy of generally. Sometimes you can play 2 if you have a lot of good value creatures to get back, some higher rarity things, or, you know, you just have like a lot of the good commons, you have a lot of ETB Tempt creatures, or a bunch of Dunlop Crebanes. Maybe, you know, this is a card that is only as good as your creatures are, but still most of the time I think you want a copy of it. And the first copy is going to be good, you know, just getting back a thing in the ring tempting you, that is played strong. But it's also conditional in the sense that you don't want to have too many of them in your opening hand. And it's just the kind of card in general, is like buy something back from the graveyard cards that are worse in your opening hand than if you draw it on turn 5 or whatever. And the reason I'm using this as an example for why opening hand win rate might be better as a metric to evaluate cards than game and hand win rate is because this card has a pretty big difference between its opening hand win rate and game and hand win rate. Like I just mentioned, these kind of cards are going to be better not in your opening hand, but it has a very high game and hand win rate. And if you're just looking at game and hand win rate, you might look at Sam's Desperate Rescue as one of the better commons in the set, because that's where it's performing, but based on just game and hand win rate. The idea, and I have to give credit to Danelius, who is a very active member in my Discord, and also NCAA, who also, this is something that both of them kind of been hammering home in their experiences with the set. And the idea is that because a lot of decks will have access to consistent looting, if you're drafting in a way that you're prioritizing the ring tempts you cards as you should, your deck will have a lot of card filtering in the mid game. Why this matters is because generally when we select cards to put in our deck, you want a good mix of early game cards and cards that are good later, right? Cards that are good in your opening hand, but you can't just have cards that are good in opening hand like your 2-drops and your 1-drops. You want to have some stuff up the curve as well. But in this set, since you can loot away the cards that are only good in your opening hand or better than in your opening hand, so when you draw them later, when you draw those 2-drops later, it's not that big of a deal because you can often loot them away to get to more impactful stuff. You should be prioritizing the cards that are good in your opening hand higher because they'll be good early, just naturally, when you draw them and play them. Like you know, the 2-drop will be good on turn 2, but also when you draw it late, it's not that bad. And that can't be said for the cards that are only good later, because the cards that are only good later, or at least excel later, like Sam's Desperate Rescue, aren't going to be good in your opening hand, but still will be good in your later hands, right? The mid part of the game, late part of the game. So basically, there's just 2 states of the game, right? There's the early and the late, and this is an oversimplification a little bit, but if you're just thinking of it as there's the early game and there's the late game, well, the cheap cards and the cards that are good in your opening hand, those are good, at least to some degree, in both of those game states, where cards like Sam Desperate Rescue is only good in the later part of the game. So that's a way to interpret it. You know, take that information as you will. I do like, back to this card, I do like a copy of Sam's Desperate Rescue. Like I mentioned, especially if you have some good value creatures, that also plays pretty well with the land cyclers, just being able to cycle your land cyclers early and then buy them back later. But don't be fooled by this card's game in hand win rate necessarily, because it's over-representative, I think, of how this kind of card performs in this format. That was a lot of kind of numbers and abstractions, so just to put a button on it, if you have a lot of Tempt cards, you should prioritize expensive cards or cards that are good in the late game only, a little bit lower than you would if you don't have a lot of tempting. If you don't have a lot of tempting, you might want to put some more expensive cards in your deck because you're not going to have that late game grind. You're not going to be able to compete in the late game as well as somebody who has a lot of tempt cards in their deck, and they're just going to be able to filter their draws at will. you kind of need to like tussle with some more expensive stuff. Oh, and I meant to kind of mention this when we were at the top when I was talking about black, but black overall as a color and strategically what it's doing, like the reason it's really good, or one of them, is it just pairs very well with every single color. Like black red and white black are two of the best decks in the format. Black green is the best green deck. Black blue is a pretty good deck too. So it's just playing your typical like black grindy, attrition-y plan, maybe somewhat aggressive leaning. It's not too complicated. It's just that all of the black cards are good for the most part, and they pair up well with all of the other colors. All right, now let's move on to red. So I would describe red as kind of like black light. Like it has a lot of the same qualities of what makes the black cards good. Like pretty good at all points of the game, good interaction, pairs well with all the other colors, has access to pretty good temp stuff. It just doesn't, I would say, like, slightly worse, ever so slightly worse, and its roster of commons is not as deep. So, the top two red commons are Rally at the Hornburg and Smite the Deathless. Rally at the Hornburg is make 2 1/1 human soldier tokens, and your humans gain haste until end turn. Smite the Deathless is the 2-mana instant, deals 3 to target creature, and that creature loses indestructible and exile instead if it were to die. Unlike black, when I was comparing Crebain to Proclaim the Oppression, I was saying they're pretty close. I actually do think Rally at the Hornburg is the better card. And Smite is a great card, don't get me wrong, but just the raw amount of power for what you're getting for your mana on Rally, it's so good. Like, this is such a pushed version of this effect. It's just the classic example of a card that we've seen, you know, pretty often. 2 mana, make 2 tokens, but just tweak it a little bit, give both those tokens haste, and you make the card quite a bit better. And it's, of course, it's not just these tokens. You can combo it on turn 4 or turn 5, give something else haste as too, another human, right? But just the raw power. Like, I really just want to hammer that home, how good of a card this is. Smite the Deathless is an extremely efficient removal spell. And those are the qualities of a good card. Cheap, deal 3. There's nothing wrong with it, right? I'm not trying to talk down this card at all. I'm just trying to say, even though Smite is a great removal spell, the raw power of Rally the Hornburg is better. Now, I could see an argument if you do happen to be in a more controlling deck, taking Smite over Rally, but even still, as a defensive tool, Rally is pretty good, because there are a lot of X-Wings in the format, so just being able to trade those off, or being able to block somewhere and sacrifice another body, it's still a really good defensive tool. I know there's going to be a population of people who will never take a removal spell over a card like Rally at the Hornburg, but I do believe, this is my opinion, of the opinion of a lot of people out there as well who are crushing the set, that Rally is the better card. You should take it early over Smite. Next up, the tier right below that, we have Coral's End and Relentless Rohirrim. So Coral's End is 2 and a red for a sorcery as an additional cost to cast this card. You discard a card, draw 2 cards, you create a 1/1 human soldier token, and then Relentless Rohirrim is the 4 mana, 3 and a red, 4/3 that when it ATBs Temps you. I've talked about that one already a little bit. It's just good, you know, kind of the red version of the Uruk-hai Berserker. But Coral's End is one that's might be surprising to some people that it's this high on the list. So this card is actually exactly like Rye the Hornburg, right? You change the card just a little bit. You change Tormenting Voice to make it 1 mana more, but you get a body along with it. That makes it a considerably better card. Just, you know, having that 1/1 to attack, to sacrifice, to equip, to block with, to do whatever, right? It triggers your human synergy cards if you care about that kind of stuff. And the games do get into a grind a lot of the time. You know, it's that dynamic of, well, if I play a 2-drop and you play a 2-drop and I play a 3-drop and you play a 3-drop, like, nobody's really running anybody over. It is a bit more of an attrition game, even like a red-white deck versus a red-white deck. You do kind of get into these points where it's like, well, I'm evenly matched against you, I'm keeping pace. And this is a good tool to grind. Not only are you fine casting it on turn 3, you know, sometimes you have an opening hand with like 5 lands and you're like, great, it's cast on turn 3, it's great. But later on, you refill with this. So a really quality card. I would play 2 copies of it. Notably, it's worse in like a red-white aggro deck than it would be in a red-blue spells deck, which I think is the best home for it, or even just like a red-black deck. But if you're at all a mid-rangey or slower red deck, you're very happy to play multiple copies. And even in those red-white aggro decks, I don't think the first copy is bad. Like, philosophically, there's the idea that you shouldn't play Tormenting Voice in your aggressive decks. Aggressive decks don't want to flood. They don't want to hit land 7 a lot of the time, but they also can't afford to just like spend 2 mana to filter their draws. Like, you need to be affecting the board. Coral's End bucks that a little bit, where, yes, like, you're not affecting the board as much as maybe casting a 3 mana 3/3 would be, but you're still affecting the board enough, and the human token matters enough that it goes from an effect that you can't really afford to play in your aggressive decks to one you're like pretty okay, pretty fine playing. Again, not a priority, but still playable in the aggressive deck. And then the last tier of good red commons, we've got Improvised Club, 1 and a red for an instant. Sacrifice a creature or artifact, and as an additional cost to cast this card, and it deals 4 to any target. you're going to play a copy of this in basically all your red decks. In some decks where you have a lot of cards that make multiple bodies, Dunlin Crebanes and Rally the Hornbergs, you can play multiples, but if you aren't a deck that's particularly set up, you've got 6-7 cards that make multiple, either, two multiple creatures, or you could have something that makes a food token in a creature. That's fine, because of course you can sacrifice an artifact to this thing too. You do feel pretty bad drawing the second copy if you're not a deck that's set up like that. But yeah, if you got like 6 things that make a food or make multiple bodies, yeah, I would be fine playing the second copy. And then War Beast of Gorgoroth. This is one that I think also is not on many people's radars. This is the 5 mana 5/4. When it or another creature with power 4 or greater you control dies, you amass Oryx 2. This is just a solid 5-drop. It takes a lot for me to just say, hey, this 5-drop's just solid. But this counts. It blocks everything. It trades and dries into something good. It attacks pretty well. So not a card you want to overload on, but if you need some top end, it's a solid card. And red place in the format, like you mentioned, kind of is black light. Like it has good cards. It pairs well with basically every color, even with green, which, I think green red is the second best green deck. And it's also not necessarily aggressive or controlling. Like, I think a lot of the cards, one of the reasons the color is so good is because a lot of the cards play both ways. Rally and Smite the Deathless, good in aggro, good in control. Corals and Relentless Rohirrim, kind of the same thing. Club, probably a little bit better in an aggressive deck, but I've had a lot of blue-red decks that just make multiple permanents that I can sack, make treasures and stuff. And War Beast, probably a little bit better in the aggressive decks too, just as like a good top-end card. But all of red cards are pretty flexible. All right, next color to talk about is blue. And I went back and forth between putting blue as the third best color and white as the third best color. If you asked me 5 days ago, I would probably have told you white, but I do think now blue is definitely coming up on my rankings. I know a lot of the top players, including NCAA, who I mentioned a minute ago, have blue as... He was telling me he likes blue as the best color on Arena right now. I think it's a little bit of a hot take for my blood. I think I still personally have black as the best color. But I could definitely see the argument that it is in the same territory, the same sphere as red. The idea that he was putting forth basically is that right now on Arena, the color is drafted incorrectly. People are taking the bad blue cards over the good blue cards. Like, even if you're sitting beside somebody who's drafting blue, it is likely they're going to prioritize the wrong cards. The 2 top blue commons, which aren't being taken all that highly, are Birthday Escape, like I mentioned, single blue mana, draw a card, the ring tempts you. You kind of just want as many of these as you can get. And Glorious Gale, which is the 2 mana instant, 1 in a blue, counter target creature spell, and if it was legendary, the ring tempts you. I was a little bit down on this card last week, just noting that there's a lot of sagas, there's a lot of amass spells that create a creature that aren't actually creature, type line creature that this misses. And that's true, but it's still not enough to make me think that Essence Scatter or an Essence Scatter variant is bad. It's still a very good card. I'm still happy with it. Blue still has a lot of instants that you can hold up, and you don't have to hold this up on turn 2. You can just play out your stuff, and then after your cards are played out, you hold this up, and you don't necessarily have to be wasting mana if you're just playing to the board and then holding up this later. I want to point out, and not with nice words, but with mediocre words, Ithilien Kingfisher. So this card is currently being drafted as the top blue common. If you just look at the 17 land stats and where people are taking cards, people are taking this card above Birthday Escape and Glorious Gale. And I think a lot of people read this card and they're like, oh, it's kind of like Inspiring Overseer or Cloudkin Seer. It's much worse than that. It's not a bad card. I would consider it a playable filler card, but you just don't have to take this card that highly. A Death Trigger is much worse than an ETB trigger. Prioritize Birthday Escape and Glorious Gale over this card. I don't care that much if I have a Kingfisher. I want as many copies as I can get of both Escape and Glorious Gale. And then past that, we have 2 cards that, again, might be surprising people. These are other cards that are not being drafted that highly, but are performing very well. Number 1, we have Deceive the Messenger. Single blue mana instant. Target creature gets -3, -0 until end of turn. You amass Oryx 1. Think of this as a kill spell for X1s that leaves behind a 1/1, right? Just like 1 mana will make a 1/1 and you block their 2/1 attacking you. It does play worse if you have other amass cards in your deck because, then it's not getting that ambush, 1/1 ambushing a 2/1 effect. It's more like, okay, shrink something in combat, grow my amass army. But the first copy of this in my blue decks, I'm very, very happy with it. And I play 2 too. Like, sometimes you shirt off the 1/1, you cast it, kill a thing, shirt off the 1/1, do it all again. Decks do tend to have multiple 1/1s lying around. Even if you're just killing a 1/1 token that was made from a spell, they cast Protector of Gondor. 4 mana 3/3 ETBs make a 1/1. If this just snipes off that 1/1 and then the next turn teams up on a double block you're pretty happy about that. Like, that's just really good for your 1 mana. And then Pelargir Survivor. This is the 1 in a blue 1/3 that taps out a mana of any color, but spend it only to cast instant or sorceries. This is a card that we've seen variants of in the past that have not been particularly good, so I can see why people would be underrating this card. But 1/3 is a great body in this format because of the ring. Adding a mana of any color is definitely helpful. That last ability, sorry, I didn't even read it out, but also has the mill ability of 5 in a blue, tap, mill, target player mills 3 cards. You can win the game with that ability eventually. So this is a card that, as long as you're like in a blue-black or a blue-red spells deck, I'm pretty happy with a lot of copies of. Then we move on to the kind of third tier here. Isolation of Orthanc, the 4 mana instant, put a creature on top of its owner's library, second from the top. Lorien Reveal, the 5 mana draw through its island cycling. Soothing of Smeagol, which is 1 in a blue instant, return target non-token creature to its owner's hand. The ring tempts you. Notably, Soothing is a card that is similar to Sam's Desperate Rescue, where its opening hand win rate is much lower than its game in hand win rate. Because you don't want to bounce spell in your opening hand very often. You just want to be able to cast that in the mid part of the game and bounce their big creature. It doesn't do too much in the early game. But I do like all these cards. I'll play Lorien Revealed, that's a card I'll play multiple copies of. Same with Isolation, too. And I think Soothing is really good as a 1-up. And then we get to White. And White's not that much worse than Blue, in my opinion. I think it suffers from the opposite problem of Blue, where it's a bit overdrafted. People take the right cards, which, you know, it's going to happen. People are going to figure out what the good cards are eventually. But, you know, for some colors, it happens sooner rather than later. With White, the top 2 commons are Protector of Gondor, that 4 mana 3/3 that ETBs and makes a 1/1, and Errant Rider of Gondor, the 2 in a white 3/2 that ETBs, and you draw a card, and then if you don't control a legend, you have to put a card from your hand on the bottom. Just really solid cards. These are really White's only 2 standout commons. Past that, it gets a little bit dicey. I think the next best common, which is a big step down, is ETH Farthing Farmer. It is 2 in a white for a 2/3. When it ETBs, you make a food token, and then target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Where, +1/+1 for each food token you control until end of turn. This is not a amazing card, but it is solid. The food synergies have really fallen through. I don't think food synergy is a very good thing to be doing in this set, but this card just on its own is fine. Just coming in, buffing something, make a food token. Totally fine and playable, if not unexciting. And then right below that, we've got Westfold Rider, which is the 2 mana 3/1 that you can sack it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. And Stalwarts of Osgiliath, the 5 mana 4/3 that when ETB's ring tempts you, whenever you draw your second card each turn, you put a counter on it. You know, we are fairly quickly getting to, well, you know, not fantastic commons. These are fine filler, but the other 3 commons we talked about are really the only ones I'm like actively happy to have in my deck. Stalwarts especially is a card that only is good if you have other Tempt cards, in my opinion. And I think a problem with White is just its interaction's not very good. All 3 of its removal spells, Hobbit Sting, the Pacifism, 3 mana Pacifism variant, and the 5 mana Exile something, or 3 mana to exile it if it was tapped. None of those are particularly good. Hobbit Sting especially suffering from the fact that since the food synergies are not particularly good, you don't often get the benefit of it counting your food and your creatures. It's usually like, okay, I'm just counting my creatures. And it's fine, by the way, for a color to not have good interaction. Like, as long as it has a bunch of other great cards, then it's going to be a good color. But generally, the good cards, when Wizards designs cards, they expect some of them to be those interaction spells. So when these slated good cards turn out to be not so good, like the white interaction spells, that kind of cuts into the number of cards you're happy to play in the color. So white's a fine color, and I think especially at uncommon, there's a lot of good uncommons. But at the common level, I've been unimpressed with it as the days have gone on. All right, then we get to the problem child, which is green. And I don't think it's unplayable. I called it close to Battle for Zendikar bad in a tweet earlier this week. I have since rescinded that opinion. And by the way, if you don't know, Battle for Zendikar, green in that set was like the worst any color has ever been, or at least, the bottom 5 of color has any been in any set. It's not that bad. It's playable. You just have to make sure you're prioritizing the right cards. So first of all, you don't want to be prioritizing the food cards like I mentioned, just anything that looks like it plays well with food, like the Mushroom Watchdogs. I think that card is not particularly good. Green's 3 good commons are Ent's Fury, which is the 1 in a green fight spell, Generous Ent, the 5/7 land cycler with reach that ETBs makes a food, and Wost Pathfinder, the 1 in a green 1/1 that taps to add a mana of any color, and then you can pay 7 and tap it, and target creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. Green does 2 things well, and those 2 things can be intertwined. They can be in the same deck. But 1, it helps you cast cards of other colors, so you don't have to put too many green cards in your deck. And 2, it has good Tree Folk. The Tree Folk are all pretty good cards. generous ends. And Enraged Horn, the 5 mana 4/5 that tramples, and ETB Temps. Quick Beam, which is the 6 mana legend, the 5/6 that ETBs gives something, 2 things +2/+2 and trample. Old Man Willow, which is the black-green uncommon. Like, all those are pretty good if you just want like a quick, hey, how do I take the good green cards? The Tree Folk are pretty good. So generally when you're drafting green, it's gonna be because it's pretty open and you're using Wost Pathfinder and Many Partings, which is the single green sorcery that you can search your library for a basic land, put it in your hand, and make a food token. You're using these 2 cards to help you cast cards of a bunch of different colors. And I've seen some really wild, like 5-color decks. It's just the classic, hey, I've got 5 pieces of 5-color fixing. Let me jam in these like 6 really good, these gold cards or these rares or whatever. And you're going to need to supplement your decks with some things. The passable green commons, like I mentioned earlier, Enraged Horn, the 5 mana 4/5 trample that Temps, Mirror Guardian, the 3 mana 4/2 that when it dies, the ring Temps either is passable. Mirkwood Spider, 1 mana 1/1 Death Touch that whenever it attacks target legend or creature you control gains Death Touch in an turn. This is just a pretty good thing to just block early aggression, but also to block Ring Bearers. This is one of the best things, one of the best cards to deal with Ring Bearers. And it's kind of that simple. Like to put a button on green, you don't want to have it as your first choice. It's going to be the color you move into if you open Radagast, which is a really absurd mythic. That's the 2/5 for 4 that like draws you a bunch of cards. Like that card is really, really good. It's the one rare that I'm like, okay, that pulls me into green. There's also Generous Halfling, which is the 1 mana 1/2 that taps to add colorless and taps to add a mana of any color for legend. Like that card is also very, very good. Or you're gonna get into green because it's just nothing else is open and you're getting past the Ents and the Tree Folk and Wost Pathfinder. And I think generally, if you are in green, either your secondary color is going to be very deep or very open. That's why one of the reasons green-black is a good deck, because you can just pair your green cards you're getting with all the good black cards, or you're filling out your deck with cards of other colors. You're splashing good red cards in your black-green deck or something like that. That's the general blueprint for green, and I think as the weeks go on, you're going to need to get into green more often because the good colors are going to become more contested. And yeah, I don't think the color is unplayable, just you should lean away from it before leaning into it. Okay, so those are generally what the colors are doing. I want to touch quickly on the fact that splashing is pretty difficult, and you generally shouldn't do it in this set. So the problem with splashing is that the fixing tools are not very good. Outside of green, I was just mentioning when you're green, that's kind of your thing you're doing, but if you're not green, splashing is difficult because the colorless options are not particularly good. So we've got Inherited Envelope, which is the 3 mana artifact. Tap it to add a mana of any color, and when it ETBs the ring Tempts you. That card is clunky. It's not particularly good. Wizard's Rocket, single mana, ETBs tapped. You can pay X and sack it to add X mana of any colors, and you draw a card when it goes to the graveyard. This card is also not that good. It's also pretty clunky. One-time fixing. It has to just sit around. It's got the awkward thing. It was like, well, if you draw it early, it sits around, and it just, like, you have to keep it there if you want to count it as a source, and then only crack it when you actually draw your card you're splashing. Or if you draw it late, after you've already drawn your card that you're trying to cast, well, it comes in taps, so that's a little bit slow. So not particularly good. And then Shire Terrace. I do really want to call this card out. This is the land taps for colorless mana, but you can also pay 1 and tap it to sack it. Look for basic land and put it on the battlefield. This card is much, much worse than Evolving Wilds. I think if you've played with the card, you've kind of felt that. But I do see some people asking about this card, and if it's just a card you should play. Like, you shouldn't play this in your 2-color decks. I think it makes your mana base much too slow. There's always the trade-off between consistency of getting your color and the rate that you're paying for getting that consistency. Like, obviously, your decks would prefer more mana sources than not, but at what cost? Like, you wouldn't just put a bunch of Inherited Envelopes in your 2-color deck to have a better mana base. And there's a line somewhere you have to draw where it's like, this is not good enough, even though it makes me hit my colors more often. I think Shire Terrace falls below that line of not good enough just because it is so slow and so clunky. The one card that I do like at common for colorless fixing is Great Hall of the Citadel. This is the colorless land that pay 1 and tap it, add 2 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast legendary spells. The reason this card is pretty good is most of the time when you're splashing something, it's going to be a good legend, a good rare, and a lot of the good rares are legends. So this helps you splash the cards you want to splash. And the idea here is that you just have enough legendary creatures in your deck where this taps for mana for like 7 or 8 of your cards, and that's not too difficult, right? So basically you're thinking like in your 2 colors, your base 2 colors, maybe you have 5-6 legends and you're splashing like another legend, like you have a black red deck and you're splashing Shalab, the black green spider, and like it is cast 7 of your spells already. So it's not that bad there. It's better. It's gonna be better than Shire Terrace for sure. So it's a untapped land that adds colorless mana for a lot of your spells, but you need to hit the deck building requirement of like I have 6 or 7 legendary creatures before you're willing to play it. If you are there though, it becomes a good fixing tool. I'll also say that like the other 3 cards I was talking about, Shire Terrace, Wizard's Rockets, Inherited Envelope, they are not unplayable, but you really have to be casting a supremely good card if you're casting it, like, you know, something like Orcish Bowmasters, which is still a card I would splash a lot of the time, or something like the blue-white Faramir, right? That 4-mana 3/3 at rare. When at the end step, you choose for your opponent to either attack you or not attack you, and if they disagree with you, you get to get something good. You either draw a card, make a bunch of 1/1s. That card is very good. I would consider splashing that card off of something like a Terrace or a Wizard's Rockets, but you would hope to find Great Hall and have enough legends to make that a good land in your deck first. This is mostly just to say, don't splash unless you're green or you have the deck building requirements of Great Hall, or your deck, the card you're splashing is just phenomenal. And next up, a big part of doing all of this format is knowing what the top uncommons are. Seriously, because this is, it's not a pauper format, it's not a prince format, it's an uncommon format, whatever you want to call that. And I've got a list here of the top uncommons. The ones in front of me right now are the honorable mentions. And for this list, because this is a pretty long list, I'm mostly just going to read out names, go into depth sometime to explain why the card is pretty good. But my honorable mentions list is Gandalf Sanctions, which is the 1 blue-red sorcery that deals damage equal to the number of spells in your grave, then deals excess damage to the opponent. Denethor, Ruling Steward, the 1 black-white 2/4 signpost uncommon. Mouth of Sauron, the blue-black 3/4 signpost uncommon that amasses equal number of spells in your grave. Frodo Baggins, the green-white 1/3 that tempts you and it has to be blocked if it's the Ring Bearer. Gothmog, Morgul Lieutenant, the 4-mana 3/3 that amasses 1 and has creature tokens you control have Death Touch. Book of Miserable, the saga that says amass 1, amass 2, and then the 3rd chapter is it pumps your team, gives them +1/+0 and menace. Bilbo, Retired Burglar, this card's just great. It's 1 blue-red for a 1/3, tempts you when it enters a leave, and when it hits the opponent, draw a card. And Theoden, King of Rohan, this is the 1 red-white 2/3 that when it enters the battlefield, or another human, something gets double strike. So these are your honorable mentions. These are great cards, fantastic. But let's just go through the top 10, and I think most of these are pretty self-explanatory, so I don't have to explain those honorable mentions. Going to the bottom of this top 10 list, we got Foray of Orcs, which is the 4-mana amass 2. When you do, Foray of Orcs deals X damage to target creature and opponent controls, where X is the amass army's power. Just a very powerful card. Golem, Patient Plotter, 2-mana 3/1 that when it leaves the battlefield tempts you, and you can sack a creature and pay black to return Golem to your hand. 2-mana 3/1, not a bad rate. It gets in, you're pretty happy. It gets blocked, you're pretty happy. The fact that it can continually keep tempting you is pretty darn good. Moving on to the next tier up, we got Shadow Summoning, which is the black-white sorcery. Create 2 tapped 1/1 flyers. This card is a little bit lower than some of the next cards in the list just because it's gold, but you could argue it's actually a better card. Next up, we've got Golem's Bite and Ranger's Firebrand, which are kind of similar cards. They're good for the same reasons. Golem's Firebite is single mana instant. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. You can pay 4 mana to exile this from your grave to have the ring tempt you. And Ranger's Firebrand sorcery deals 2 to any target. The ring tempts you. Just cheap interaction spells that tempt. So, it's just basically 2 great tastes that taste great together. And then we get to our top 6 uncommons here. So this one, I do want to dive in a little bit more, explain why they're so good. So, uncommon number 6 here. Voracious Fellbeast. 6 mana, 4 black for a 4/4 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Create a food token for each creature sacrificed this way. Card is a real beating. Sometimes it is a little bit slow. It's 6 mana, but don't confuse slow with bad, right? A lot of people go like, ooh, 6 mana, but it's a lot of powerful for 6 mana. Sometimes you just snipe off a token. Like, a lot of people look at the fail case, they're like, I cast my Fellbeast and they have a token to sack. That's still pretty good, right? And then some amount of the time, you do nab a creature that's worth 3, 4, 5 mana if you're lucky. Getting a food token is awesome too. So it's a big stabilizing play, blocks pretty well, closes out the game, stabilizes you multiple ways. Just a very good card. Number 5 here, Grishnok Brash Instigator. 3 mana, 2 and a red for a 1/1. When ATBs, you amass Orcs 2. And when you do, until end of turn, gain control of target non-legendary creature. And careful of that, non-legendary. And opponent controls with power less or equal to the amassed army's power. Then you untap that creature. So, baseline, this is 3 mana, make a 1/1 and a 2/2. That's great. And then if you just cast this on turn 3, a lot of times you steal their 1-drop or their 2-drop, and it's like 3 mana, make a 2/2 and a 1/1 and deal your opponent 2. Sometimes 4 if you've also played a 2-drop. You just get that big boost, and that's awesome. And then the top end of this card is you win the game, right? Like, you steal their thing, you set it up. It's not that hard to engineer situations where, your opponent doesn't know that you have an active treason effect in your hand, and that can just be the difference between who's supposed to be racing and not. Number 4, Saruman's Trickery. This card is fantastic. 2 blue for an instant. Counter target spell, Amass Orcs 1. We've seen a lot of this kind of card in the past, just the cancel variant with upside. Making a 1/1 is gigantic upside. And I do want to note, like I've been referring to Amass Orcs 1 as make a 1/1 for this and Deceive the Messenger, the blue -3, -0. And then you Amass Orcs 1. Mostly because in your blue decks, this will be the first thing that's, the first Amass card you're going to be playing. Not always, but it's not like if this was a red-black card, I think it would be a little bit worse. But a lot of the time, it is just make a 1/1. And even if it's just put a counter on, it's not the worst thing in the world. This card might surprise people how higher it is in the list, but just counter a target spell and make a 1/1 is such a good rate. Like, that's just pure power. I was talking about Riot, the Hornbrook being raw power, just bang for your buck. That's what you're getting with Trickery here. And it also helps that this is a set that has 2 mechanics that incentivize you to cast spells pre-combat, both Tempting and Amass. Make your opponent want to cast spells pre-combat, and often what will happen is, like, you counter their 4-drop, and you have a 1/1, and they were going to be like, okay, I'm going to cast my spell that amasses, have a good attack, and you're like, nope, actually, I counter that spell for probably, potentially even less mana than you paid, and I make a new blocker. So, maybe you get to double block, or maybe they have an X1 on the battlefield. So it's just a lot for the mana you're paying. And then the top 3, Busto, uncommons, and this is really like where we're getting to top 5, 10 cards in the set. Like, these cards are excellent. You can make an argument for any of them being 1, 2, 3. I'm just going to list them in this order, though. Fear Fire Foes, X and a red, sorcery. Damage can't be prevented this turn. Fear Fire Foes deals X damage to target creature, and 1 damage to each other creature with that same controller. Really is one-sided field wipe a lot of the time, even when it's not. Just killing 2 things with it's good. The worst case scenario is you're spending a little bit more than your opponent probably spent for their creature to kill it. So the ceiling is high, the floor is high. Like, the floor is pretty high, the ceiling is absurd on this card. The Fear Fire Foes is better than most of the rares, and so are the next 2 cards too. Next up is Aylmer of Rittermark. This is 5 mana, 4 and a red for a 4/5 haste. When it attacks, if you control a creature with the greatest power amongst creatures in the battlefield, you make a 1/1 white human soldier token, and often if you're attacking with this, you will. So let's imagine a few game states, right? I think if you face this card, you know how absurd it is, but just imagine, bear with me here and imagine a few game states. You're ahead, and you cast this card. You're probably just going to win that game, right? Because you would bash them for 5, make a 1/1. They have to scramble to kill this, and as they're scrambling to kill this, your other things probably get in. Okay, you're at parity. Well, it's still pretty good there, because a lot of times you can get into that hit for free if they, they are attacking you. You find an opportunity where you get in for 5, they weren't expecting this to come down, you make a 1/1. The race is very much swung in your favor. And let's say you're behind. This card's still pretty good with you when you're behind, because, if you absolutely have to, you block with your 5/4, okay. But a lot of times you're, like, behind in the way that, okay, my opponent was racing me, and I can't really race them back. Well, if you play Aomar and you're a little bit behind in that kind of way, you attack them back for 5, and again, they're probably going to be attacking you, so you're going to get in that hit. You make 1/1 most likely, and now it's like your opponent's like, well, I was ahead and I was attacking, but now they're going to have a 1/1 each turn if I don't chill and try to deal with this Aomar a little bit. So it's just a really fantastic card in every state of the game. And then the last one here I have, and this is my number 1, but Aomar, Nazgul, Fear Fire Foes, I think you can argue for number 1. Nazgul. Nazgul is so much better than it reads, and it reads pretty well. So this is the 2 and a black, 1/2 Death Touch. When it ETBs, the ring tempts you, and whenever the ring tempts you, you put a +1/+1 counter on each Wraith you control, which is, other Nazguls as well, and of course has the line of the deck can have up to 9 cards named Nazgul, which, by the way, is funny, is actually a downside in Limited, because usually there's not a limit on the number of cards you can have, but this puts the limit at 9. Not that that would ever happen, but this card is phenomenal. Just, when I read this card first, I was like, okay, it looks pretty good, right? And of course, I've been talking this whole podcast about how anything with Tempt is pretty good. But when you play it and you realize that, 2/3 Ringbearer Death Touch is close to just having like a first strike Death Toucher. Like a creature your opponent can never interact with profitably in combat, because this can't trade. Like, you attack with your 2/3 Death Touch Ringbearer. Well, they can't block with a 3/3, obviously. They can't block with a 6/6, even more obvious. They have a 2/3. Well, they can block with it, but that's just gonna get eaten, right? So really, you need a cheap Death Toucher, and that's like Mirkwood Spider, the green 1/1. And other than that, like, you need to cast a removal spell on this to deal with it efficiently, or make a really bad double block or something. There's no clean way to deal with this card, because you can't deal with it in combat, and it has an ETB, so removal is bad against it too, to some degree. And then, of course, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Like, the one thing I could say in that situation, I was saying, oh, you just can't deal with it in combat, is it's only 2 power, so you can deal, take a hit or two from it for a while. But, like, when it starts to grow to 3, 4 power, you just can't ignore it at that point. And then, like I mentioned, if you happen to have multiples, they grow each other twice, right? So you cast an Nazgul, and it becomes a 2/3. You cast another one, they're going to see each other, and they're both going to become 4/5s. So, just, phenomenal at all points of the game. And like I mentioned, all of those uncommons I just mentioned, you really, really want to pay attention to those. Those are your power cards. Those are the ones, like, if you open those or get past them, those are, like, your rares, basically. It's like the equivalent of opening a good rare, because there's not a ton of good rares in this set. So really just look at that list I just presented. And, of course, as always, I do have my 17lands.com tier list. I'll put that in the description if you want to have a reference point. I do keep that updated. And in my list, I've got these cards in the A range, right? Like these tippity-top uncommons. And that doesn't happen very often for uncommons. So really, really do take note of these. So we've talked about some big picture ideas, some important things for success, the commons, the uncommons, a lot of the relevant cards in the set individually. Let's close out here by talking about some of the archetypes, starting with the best archetype, red-black. And I've talked a lot about this deck already, but a lot of why it thrives is it's just playing the TM good cards, right? But also it is the home for the set's best mechanics, Amass and Tempting. It's got a lot of really good Tempting cards, but it's just your quintessential good mid-range deck. It's really good at attacking, pressuring early. Sometimes you just curve out. You play your 2, your 3, your 4, you just kill them. You've got Mahur, Urukai, Captain, if you're lucky, on turn 2. That's the red-black 2/2 menace at uncommon that says if one or more +1/+1 counters will be put on an army, goblin, or orc you control, you put that many +1, +1/+1 counters instead. Like, this card's just a beating, like this into Crabane, into something else. Just really game over a lot of the time. So, I mentioned this a little bit last week, but I do think when you're, aside from just focusing on taking the good cards, the cards I mentioned today, you do kind of want to think, am I going to be an all-in Amass deck or more of a all-in Tempting deck? And you can have a mix and match, it doesn't matter too much, but as you're drafting, the more Amass stuff you have, I think the more you want. The more Tempting stuff you have, the more that you want. Again, you can have an even split, but it's just one of the small intricacies that you do want to keep in mind. And this deck kind of just plays out like if you've played red-black and constructed in the past year or two, like red-black in Standard or Pioneer or Explorer, it's kind of that style of deck. Like, the deck I'm talking about is, with Blood Tithe Harvesters and Fable of the Mirror Breakers and Shield Dreads. Like, it's just the good cards, right? Like, some of the most powerful cards in Standard. And the way it plays out is, like, you can just curve out, play your Blood Tithe Harvester into your Fable, into your Shield Dread. Your opponent just dies, right? Just like, okay, well, that was too good of a curve out. My hand was a little bit clunky. They pressured me very hard. That's what happens. But you also have these natural smoothing tools. And in Constructed, it's Fable, the Mirror Breaker, cycling some, you fixing your hand, and blood tokens from Harvester fixing your hand. But in this set, it's the ring, right? It's Tempting, getting to that second ability. You really start to get that consistency that another deck you're playing against might not necessarily have. You can also kind of think of the land cycler as filling the role of your value lands, your creature lands, like the Den of the Bugbear and the black 3/3 menace creature land. Like, they're kind of the same thing. You don't flood as much in these decks, and you're just going to draw your good cards. Like, the way a deck full of good cards loses is it doesn't draw them, or draws too many lands, right? But all of your cards being good, all your spells anyways, means that, you're just more likely to have more good spells than the opponent who's not playing red-black, and also you're less likely to flood than a lot of decks, just because you have that smoothing tool of the ring very consistently, and, maybe 2 of your lands, quote-unquote, are just land cyclers, which are also spells. So it's just, red-black, it's not that complicated, really. Just the cards I talked about today, take those good cards, and you're just playing this value aggressive mid-range game. And then there's white-black, which is a very, very similar deck. I think this is the second best deck in the format. White-black gets 2 really, really good golden commons in Shadow Summoning and Denethor, and it plays very similar, to be honest, to red-black. It's a little bit more attrition-y, I would say. The white cards aren't as good at attacking as the red cards are, so you might be playing a little bit more for getting to stage 4 of the ring, where that's how you're closing out the game, but it's a lot of the same stuff's going on. where you're this aggressive leaning mid-range deck that you're filtering your draws with the ring ability, with the second ability on the ring. You've got mostly all good cards. There's like a slight sacrifice theme going on with Denethor, but it's not like a main thing. It's really just a mid-range deck with good cards that happens to not flood very often if you're prioritizing the cards that tempt you. And there's red-white humans led by Theoden and Shadowfax, which is also a really good card. Like, this is kind of the same thing, but in the opposite end of the spectrum, where red-black mid-range is right in the middle of these Mardu decks. Then white-black is a little bit slower of a mid-range deck, and red-white I would classify as an aggro deck, but it's kind of got the same stuff going on where it's like, yeah, the red and white cards are all pretty good, although like I mentioned, the red cards maybe a little more than the white ones, but the human synergies do really make up for that in a lot of ways, right? Some of the white commons that aren't that good get a little bit better in this deck, like the 2/2 Vigilance that has pseudo death touch for armies. Like, that card being a human is going to matter a little bit more in this deck than it might in white green, for example. So some of the okay white commons do get a little bit of a bump if you have stuff like Theoden or Erkenbrand, which is the 4-mana 3/3 that pumps all your humans and pumps your team when a human comes in. And of course, Rally at the Hornburg is an excellent card in this deck. So it's just your quintessential aggressive leaning mid-range deck to aggressive deck that, once again, just has good cards. And these last three archetypes, red-white, black-white, and black-red, you can kind of think of them like the Mardu Wedge as a macro archetype in itself. You can think of this as the tempting decks. And yes, red-white's got its human synergies, and red-black has its amass synergies. But when you're in the draft, it's really good to know that all of the cards you want for these decks, like the good cards, quote unquote, allow you to pivot into one of the adjacent color pairs in this wedge, because you generally want all the same cards. Like, yes, the red-white deck's going to want humans a little bit more, but if you're just going into your draft thinking, okay, I'm going to take red, black, and white cards and prioritize tempting, well, if you start drafting red-black and you've got a lot of tempt cards, but then you realize, uh-oh, black's not that open, you pivot to red-white, maybe you open up a Theoden or get past a late Theoden. That transition's generally very smooth, whereas it's a little bit harder to transition to a green deck or even to a blue deck sometimes. Like, if you start red-white humans, it's very difficult to pivot to blue-red spells, for example. So not only are these decks powerful, these three decks, the Mardu Wedge, which I think they're the best three decks in the format, but they also give you the flexibility in the draft of being able to pivot if you need to. And then the second group of macro archetypes is the spells deck. So this is like more Grixis-y, blue, red, and black. And I really like blue-red quite a bit. Blue-black is an offshoot of blue-red in my opinion. I think the trick for blue-red is you really do want to be as low creature count as possible, really prioritizing spells that make creatures such as Rally at the Hornburg, Swarming of Moria, which is the 3 mana, 2 in a red, amass 2, make a treasure token. That card is not fantastic in general, but it is very playable in blue-red where you just want to up that spell count. Of course, the reason you're upping that spell count is for cards like Gandalf's Sanction, which is the one blue-red burn spell that cares about the number of cards in your graveyard or spells in your graveyard, and then it tramples over, the damage tramples over to their face. That can be the way you close out games. But I also really like Fiery Inscription, which is the 2 in a red enchantment, enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. Both of these cards are mediocre when you've got like 10 spells in your deck, and exceptional when you've got like 18 spells in your deck, right? 18 instant sorceries. So really, that's what makes a good red-blue deck, is creatures that make tokens, so you can up that spell count, not having to play a few creatures. And you're going to play some creatures like Bilbo, Retired Burglar. That's the 3 mana, 1 blue red, 1/3 that when it ETBs or leaves, the ring tempts you, and when it deals damage, you create a treasure token. That's a good creature. You're going to play the best of the best creatures, but especially when in this deck, you still do have a lot of Tempted by the Ring cards. You know, some of the spells will tempt you, like Birthday Escape. You do need bodies still to be able to make use of that ring. So prioritize, well, again, the rallies, the Swarming Memorials, those kind of cards, and just make sure you're prioritizing a really high spell count. Blue-black is kind of an offshoot of that. It's a lot of the same things I just talked about, but with Mouth of Sauron instead. 3 black-blue for a 3/4. When it ETBs, target player mills 3, and then you amass Orc's X, where X is the number of instants of sorceries in that player's graveyard. This one is going to be a little bit creature heavier, I believe, just because it's harder to get as many spells in blue and black than it is in blue and red. There's a density of better spells in those color pairs, but blue-black control is just a good deck. Like, it kind of is a marriage of the mid-rangey black decks that we talked about, the Mardu decks, and the blue-red spells decks. It's more similar to the blue-red spells decks, I would say, because you're prioritizing the blue spells instead of the red and black tempting cards. But a lot of the stuff I just talked about with red-blue, you can kind of apply here. So yeah, I basically think, like, if you want to think about the format as just those two main macro archetypes, Grixis spells and Mardu tempting, that will get you most of the way there. There is, of course, the green decks that I should cover too. So let's talk about black-green. Black-green is an actual good deck. I like black-green. There's nothing wrong with black-green. It gets two really good golden commons in Old Man Willow and Rise of the Witch King. Old Man Willow is the 2 black-green star. Its power and toughness is equal to the number of lands you control, and whenever it attacks, you can sack a creature or token. When you do, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. That's a good card. Rise of the Witch King is the 4 mana, 2 black-green reanimation spell. Each player sacks a creature, and if you sack a creature this way, you can reanimate a creature from your graveyard. Plays really nicely with the land cyclers, the Generous Ent, and with the troll, the 6/5 troll. You're generally going to get into black-green by starting with black cards and then getting past either these gold cards or Shalab. Shalab is, you know, the spider, the 8/8. Or you're just like, okay, well, black is kind of open and green is clearly open. I mentioned earlier the green cards you should be playing. Stay away from the food stuff for the most part. At least the food synergy cards, like, you know, a card that just makes food is fine, but cards that care about food, like Mushroom Watchdog. So yeah, black green is just a fine place to be, as long as you're in it for the right reasons. You're playing the right cards. You're not playing too many of the bad green cards, and yeah, you're focusing on the Tree Folk and these gold cards. And a few more decks to close us out here. I just do want to mention the blue-green Scry deck. Deck is not particularly good. Problem generally is that the deck aims to play a 2-drop threat and a 3-drop threat that grows, and then, like, hope to ride those to victory by scrying a bunch and making them bigger or making them unblockable. And it just doesn't work that well because you're spending time scrying instead of affecting the board, because a lot of the scry cards aren't cards that directly affect the board, and even the ones that do affect the board are not particularly well statted. So you're trying to, like, cobble together this game plan of stick a threat, make it grow, and it gets very easily disrupted if your opponent has any interaction spells. Plus, the blue and green cards don't mesh all that well together. Green wants to tap out, blue wants to leave up mana a lot of the time. I will say that if you do happen to find yourself in this deck, or no, I should say, you should only happen to find yourself in this deck if you have multiple copies of Arwen, the blue-green golden common, 2/2 for 2. Whenever you scry, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That's just, like, this is a good card. Oh, also has the scry ability, 6 mana scry 2. Like, this is the best card for the deck, even better than a lot of the rares. Like, there's 2 rares, gold rares, that care about scrying, and Arwen's just better than those. So I would not recommend getting to this deck. I think it's just too clunky, has too many issues, too many structural issues in the format. But if you do think you might move in for Arwen and pretty much nothing else. There's also white-green, and my most successful white-green decks have been, these colors are very, very open, and I have multiple copies of good legends. So Frodo Baggins, which is the green-white 1/3, that when it enters the battlefield or another legend enters, the ring tempts you, and if Frodo's the ring bearer, it has to be blocked. This card's really good. This is a very strong card. The problem with the deck, though, is it has to rely on card quality rather than synergy, because, again, the food synergies are not particularly good. So I've been in green-white when I got past the pretty late Frodo. Maybe I started white, past the Frodo, and then maybe I get past, like, a Samwise, a good green-white rare, or Arwen, the mythic green-white Arwen is excellent. So this is a deck you're going to move into only if it's very open. This is not a deck that you should aspire to get into, but if you do think you're at an open table, you do happen to get a lot of the, like, there are good cards for the deck. They're just a higher rarity, and you can't assume you're going to get them just in your average draft, right? It's going to be something that happens once every 10 or 15 drafts or something. And that's mostly it. So there are a few other decks in there, red, green, and white, blue, that I feel aren't as important. I'm not going to do a deep dive on them right now. I think I've covered most of what I have to say about the set, so thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. This episode was a bit of an editing nightmare because I'm a little bit late on this one. I apologize. My computer crashed and half of the episode got lost. So if there's anything that seems a little bit disjointed, my apologies for that. If you watched this far, consider subscribing. Consider checking out that Patreon. I believe next week's episode is going to be tackling gameplay. So check that out if you're interested. And thanks for watching and listening, everybody. We'll see you later.